Good morning, Berlin. Good afternoon. Thank you all for joining the virtual World Health Summit 2020. I'm very honored to be able to chair this session on antimicrobial resistance. When we were last year actually in person in Berlin, we had comments from the audience that because the session focused on research and development of new antibiotics, there were several comments that said that, well, antimicrobial resistance, there are a lot of other aspects that actually the World Health Summit should cover. And so we promised to come back after 1 year to look into a couple of different issues in relation to antimicrobial resistance that might not have been covered so much in depth in the past years at the World Health Summit. So this year's session is going to focus on shortages of existing antibiotics and linking this with environmental discharges of the manufacturing process. The shortages of essential medicines is an issue that that was known, I think, to specialists, to hospital pharmacists, to people working in hospitals, to actually are facing the problem that they can't access essential antibiotics or essential health products. But it has come to the forefront of the discussion with the COVID-19, where we had shortages not only of antibiotics, but of painkillers, of oxygen, of ventilators and other health products. And today we are going to look into the specific issue of shortages of antibiotics. And I've recently reviewed the statistics for a couple of European countries, and we can see the same trend in France and Switzerland and in other countries where in particular old parenteral antibiotics, so injectable antibiotics that are used in hospitals, are often in shortages, meaning that basically hospitals are not able to buy the product on the market, and they have to make a great effort to buy the product elsewhere or to replace it with other products. And this has become one of the big challenges actually in procurement for hospitals. So today we have a panel with us with really eminent experts in the area. And unfortunately, Thomas Garms had to drop out because he couldn't make it today. But I'm sure that we are going to provide you a very interesting session. And I would like to hand over to Celine Puccini. Celine is a professor at the University of Lorraine in France. And in 2019, the French Minister of Health, Agnès Buzyn, entrusted her with the implementation of the national strategy to fight against antimicrobial resistance. And now her mission at the ministry is to implement the national action plan and reach a reduction of 25% of the antibiotic consumption in France by 2024. So that is a tough objective, Celine, but today you're going to tell us a bit about the overall problem of shortages, and I'm looking forward to your introduction into the problem. Over to you.
Thanks a lot, Peter, and thanks for the introduction. So yes, I have a mandate in human health working at the French Ministry of Health, and in my professional life, as you said, I am an infectious diseases physician. So I will talk very briefly about the European situation and then the French situation. So first, before going into the European situation, I wanted to express my perspective as a clinician, as an ID physician. When you don't have any more first-line treatment, first-line essential antibiotics, you have to use second-line or third-line or last resort antibiotics. And that's a problem because these second-line last resort antibiotics are usually more toxic. They carry a higher risk of antibiotic resistance, for example. Sometimes they are less effective than first-line treatments. And usually they are also IV instead of oral, meaning that it is less convenient for the patient to have his or her treatment. And so it means in summarizing this, it leads to worse clinical outcomes and to decreased quality of life for patients. Also, when you have very prolonged shortages, you get used to giving or to using second-line last resort antibiotics. And then when you revert back, when the shortage is finished, when you revert back to the usual situation, sometimes clinicians forget actually using first-line antibiotics For all these reasons, actually, shortages are a threat to antimicrobial stewardship and a threat to antimicrobial resistance crisis. And also, when you look at the healthcare system, all this leads to increased workload for clinicians and also for clinical pharmacists who are the forefront of these shortages. So it means that for the healthcare system, it is increasing costs, which is also a problem. So when we look at the European situation, actually, you have shortages all around the world, but I will just give a brief overview of the EU and European situation. Actually, shortages of antibiotics were included in the 2017 AMR action plan of the EU, so it was already there. Then WHO, you remember that, Peter, you were there, you organized a meeting in Oslo in 2018, actually focusing on Europe, to bring together all the stakeholders and to discuss about this antibiotic shortages issue. Then, so that's in the middle up front, the Council conclusions that were edited in 2019, so last year, also stressed a lot the problem of antibiotic shortages. Then in the mission letter to Stella Kyriakides by the president of the European Commission, shortages are among the very highest priority in this mission letter. Then on the right, you know that the pharmaceutical strategy also puts lots of emphasis on this shortages issue. And that's probably thanks to the COVID-19 situation, as you have said. And then also the European Parliament has taken some measures, has suggested some measures, and that's on the right hand of the slide. So I think Europe really is taking action on this, even so COVID-19 has been helping us a lot to raise awareness. And there is a political momentum right now to act regarding shortages of drugs and antibiotics in particular, because that's a topic we discussed today. Then, as France, we are participating in the joint action that is the EU JAMRI. So the slide was prepared by my colleagues from Work Package 9, so Christine Ardal in Norway and Marie-Cécile Coa in France. And this joint action deals with many topics regarding AMR and healthcare-associated infections, but that includes shortages of drugs. So they did some work and they found that 8 out of 10 European countries that were interviewed state that maintaining sustainable access to older antibiotics is a major challenge. And they did a survey about use of older antibiotics with 10 European countries that replied, and they found that benzyl penicillin, which is used, for example, for syphilis, is included in national prescribing guidelines in 9 out of 10 countries, where 4 respondents state that it may be underutilized. So that's very old antibiotics. And phenoxymethyl penicillin, which is oral, is included in national prescribing guidelines in all 10 replying countries, but 3 respondents state that it may be underutilized. So there is really underuse and a threat for these very old antibiotics, but they are essential. They are listed in the EML Essential Medicine list of WHO, for example. So, and they concluded that understanding the fragile supply of older antibiotics is complicated by a lack of transparency. So, for example, they found that we don't know how many and who the suppliers are of active pharmaceutical ingredients. If I go then to France, actually, so shortages has been a topic very in the media and very a priority topic for professionals for the past, I think, 10 years, especially with Academy of Pharmacy, the Senate, and also the government. And for example, for antibiotic shortages, the topic was included in the 2015 AMR National Action Plan, that is One Health. To tackle this problem more urgently, I think the Ministry of Health launched last year a roadmap to tackle actually the shortages of drugs problem, and antibiotics are one of the topics included into this roadmap. And then specifically for antibiotics, we have what we call a contrat stratégique de filière, that is a kind of forum where industry and government can talk and can discuss topics. And this one is on antibiotic resistance. And one of the topics that was chosen is antibiotic shortages. So we have been working on this for the past years. And then, Peter, you know the slide because you're involved in that project. We were very lucky and very happy. Actually, last year we applied to what is called the Structural Reform Support Program of the European Commission. And we were selected. So we have a project for the French government that is called Ensuring the Availability of Patent Antibiotics. The objective is to address the root causes of the recurrent shortages and lack of availability of the market of patent old antibiotics in France. And this is a One Health project, meaning it will focus on human antibiotics, veterinary antibiotics, and it will take into account the environmental problem, of course. So it was made at the request of the French government with 5 ministries and 2 agencies involved. So it's a big project for us. It is co-funded by the European Commission and the WHO. And we will have actually the technical expertise and the support of WHO in cooperation with the Directorate General for Structural Reform Support, DG Reform of the European Commission. And that's Peter Bayer's team actually helping us on that. And this project will run for 3 years and it starts in a couple of days. So 1st of November, 2020. And we are very happy to have the support of the Commission and of WHO to move forward. And these are my contact details if you want to send any question or whatever afterwards. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Celine, for this overview on the situation in Europe and France. And as you said, it has been high on the agenda already. And with COVID-19, I think it will even be a bigger priority, in particular for Europe, but also for countries like Germany, France, and others. And I've seen the German government, for example, they have in their recent Eckpunktepapier of the government, they are foreseeing to invest 1 billion into local production of essential health products. I've seen that France is investing 150 or so million into local production of paracetamol. So I think we are seeing all kind of initiatives, of political initiatives that that want to tackle the problem, and but we don't really know, and governments also don't really know what are the right measures to take, because most of it is basically the market is not functioning. The market is so unattractive that the existing suppliers, in particular, that those that are situated in Europe, they drop out of the market because the competition is too intense. So there's one example, and it's not to blame the company, but GSK recently shut down production of amoxicillin in the UK, and they sent a letter to Swissmedic, the Swiss authority, and they informed the Swiss authority that they are going to track back the parenteral amoxicillin from the Swiss market, because they say it is economically not viable to sustain production in Europe. And Sandoz, which has one of the few remaining vertically integrated production plants in Austria, is facing similar problems. They have stopped doing cephalosporins a couple of years ago, and now they considered to stop producing penicillins, and it is basically a market issue. Now we see governments actually, they want to take action, and I think it's really important that we figure out what are the right actions to take, what is the sustainable solution for the problem. And we see that now also for health security reasons, countries, governments want to bring production back to Europe. But for this, I want to hand over to Joachim Larsson, who is a professor in environmental pharmacology at the University of Gothenburg in Sweden. And he has done a lot of research actually on environmental pollution from drug manufacturing, and his research on concentrations of antibiotics in wastewater from pharmaceutical production has contributed to many actually initiatives on the issue. We have seen him on TV. And so Joachim, can you tell us a bit something about this conundrum of price, production, facilities, where they are situated, how they function, what it means for the environment? Over to you.
Yes, Thank you very much, Peter, for inviting me here. And I'll try to introduce you to some aspects on antibiotic pollution from drug manufacturing, but also link it to what Celine just talked about, the shortages and the vulnerability, because I think there could be at least some partially overlapping causes and also partially overlapping solutions to these problems. So many of you know that drug production can lead to massive emissions of active ingredients into the environment. Concentrations in the milligram per liter range. And milligrams per liter, that's a lot. I've personally visited lakes in India where the concentrations of antibiotics in the water is far higher than in the blood of patients taking medications, to give some extreme examples of where it can be. So up to 1 million times higher what you see from normal emissions, if I call it normal, from usage of drugs. This means that polluted surface waters can, of course, be very toxic to aquatic wildlife, etc. But it also meant that groundwater over large areas have been contaminated, highly contaminated with antibiotics and other drugs, actually. Now, we have studied this for a number of years in India, which is one of the largest producers of antibiotics and other drugs for the world market. But examples of major emissions of drugs from production is not just an Indian issue. It's been reported repeatedly from many other countries, including large producers as China, in Europe, in the United States, from Africa, from South America, basically from all parts of the world. So it's not just an Indian thing here, something that needs to be dealt with in many different places. When it comes to antibiotics, there's a particular risk, because then we not just talk about environmental risk, then we talk about human health risks. The risks that the antibiotics may drive the development of antibiotic resistance, which then will hit back to us as well. And when we study these environments that are polluted with extreme concentrations of antibiotics from manufacturing, they harbor unprecedented abundances of resistance genes, much more than what you'll find in the intestines of a person that is taking antibiotics. And this goes on for years and years. And there's also worry here about nature contains a diversity of resistance genes that one after the other comes into human pathogens. So they basically transfer from environmental bacteria into the pathogens. So that's the worry here, that this activity, this emissions of large concentrations of antibiotics will drive the evolution and emergence of new forms of resistance in pathogens, basically. And recall that emergence of resistance, that only needs to happen once in one place of the earth. So once it's in the human microbiota, we cannot really return that evolution. We have to deal with it, and these resistant bacteria, they can travel very fast across the world. So this basically means this is everyone's problem to deal with. It's not just a problem for the country that is producing the antibiotic. Now, despite this, emissions of active ingredients in medicines, they're almost never regulated. It's not a crime to release milligrams per liter of antibiotics in many places. Also, it's usually a secret who is producing the active ingredients and where is it done, as Celine also mentioned. And public buyers of medicines, they care about lowest possible price, usually. It's very rare to find demands on pollution control. So what has driven this? So one important driver is the strong demand for inexpensive medicine, and as Peter said, malfunctioning market, actually. So the strong demand for inexpensive medicine has meant that we have outsourced productions away from the users. We don't see the pollution if there is any. The price pressure produces counter incentives for companies to invest in pollution controls. And at the same time, this fierce price pressure down to the bottom means that sometimes one or two companies can have the entire global market for an API. And this together causes vulnerability, as Celine mentioned, we may have very few companies that produces the world's supply of a certain drug. And at the same time, it drives drug pollution because there's less control in it. So there are multiple solutions to this, of course. And one is about transparency. If we would have public transparency with regards to who is producing the active ingredients in the medicines that we buy, and then we would be able to link the seller, the big seller that sells the product in the entire world, to the production site that might be in India or China or elsewhere, and then also make them accountable for the pollution. And that in turn will create incentives for those companies that care about their reputation to invest in and demonstrate pollution control. At the same time, it would also reveal these vulnerabilities in the production chains when we see that there's very few producers of a certain drugs, and make it possible for us to have certain precautionary action, which could be about rewarding diversity of API suppliers. So to my last slide, we've seen for 15 years a range of academic studies that report large emissions of drugs coming out from manufacturing and associated health and environmental health risks. We've also seen that many industries proudly present environmental reports and action plans about how they're going to do with this. They have voluntary limits that I'm sure Steve will talk about also. But what we don't hear is how much they emit. We also don't hear where they produce the drugs. The independent antimicrobial resistance benchmark, in their latest report, they report on complete lack of transparency from industry with regards to both where they are produced and how big the emissions are. The Indian government, they proposed a law this year setting limits on antibiotic emissions, but industry is lobbying against this law, so we'll see if something will happen or not. And in any way, it would only apply to India, of course. We saw in a document that came out, a technical briefing document from the WHO, OIE and FAO, that there is a value in increased transparency around emission from production and put pressure via procurement this year. We also saw just a few weeks ago that in the European pharmaceutical strategy, that there's a massive support from the EU Parliament for full transparency in the production chain of medicine, and they also support green procurement. So one may wonder, is it time for industries to step up to real responsibility? I think industry is taking some important steps, but it's naive to think that industry will resolve the industrial pollution problem themselves. We need laws, and we also need carrot and sticks to reward those who are doing right. So maybe it's time to establish EU legislation about transparency, so that we have to be transparent, as we are with so many other products in society, actually. And also perhaps reward public transparency during the procurement. Now, some may raise their fingers and saying that, oh, we don't want to risk the availability of drugs. But as long as you only reward transparency, you don't exclude anyone from the market, you just reward them, you do not risk access. Thank you.
Thank you, Joachim, for this very impressive overview on the situation in drug manufacturing in India in particular. And I think that is very frightening, in particular what you said about the concentration in certain lakes, that this is actually a million times or 1,000 times higher concentration than what you reach in a patient's blood when you are administered these kind of antibiotics. I think that, I mean, this is just how you finished. I think it's an ideal handover to Steve Brooks, because Steve is an advisor to the Antimicrobial Resistance Industry Alliance, and he chairs the manufacturing working group of the Alliance. He has more than 35 years of experience working in the industry, where he has specialized in environmental health and safety monitoring, and also influencing and reducing the emission into the environment of the manufacturing process. So he's a real expert in on how is the industry dealing with it, what you can do, what you cannot do, and here's also the brain behind the emission limits that the AMR Industry Alliance has put up for their members in 2019, I think. So Steve, if you can tell us a bit on what the AMR Industry Coalition did and how this could be linked to procurement practices, I think that would be very interesting for the audience.
Sure. Thank you, Peter. I'll be happy to do that. And I'd like to thank the two speakers on the panel that have already spoken as well. So I'll keep my remarks brief. I'm not going to use any slides, but I'll just provide some context to the work that we're doing. The AMR Industry Alliance is the life science industry's response to the AMR call for action, and we're the largest coalition of life science companies and trade associations dealing with AMR. We represent R&D, pharma, generics, biotechs, and diagnostics. Those are the organizations that form the alliance. And we're focused on 4 areas: research, access, appropriate use, and environmental aspects of manufacturing. And as Peter's already said, my focus is on the latter, on the manufacturing aspects of antibiotic manufacturing. And we've made considerable progress against a number of commitments that were made by the Alliance in late 2016. I'm going to mention those briefly, and then I'll say a little bit about what else we're doing. So in the face of concern about the risk of emissions from antibiotic manufacturing operations potentially promoting antimicrobial resistance, and Joachim's done a very nice job of setting the stage for this, and in the absence of national or international regulations or guidance covering emissions from manufacturing operations, the Alliance developed and published in 2018 a common antibiotic manufacturing framework, which sets out the requirements for Alliance members and their supply chains to ensure good environmental controls are in place in antibiotic manufacturing operations. Also, in 2018, we developed and published a list of predicted no effect concentrations, or PNECs. These are target concentrations that we use in risk assessments to determine ultimately whether emissions from manufacturing operations are acceptable. And we have published those for approximately 120 antibiotics. And in fact, I wouldn't say that I was the brains behind that at all, but certainly people in the Alliance group worked on this, and we were heavily indebted to some research work by Dr. Larson and others as well. So just to put the acknowledgement where it really should be. In addition, Alliance members publish their performance in implementing the framework and the PNECs on a biannual basis. And we do that in an aggregate format. And our most recent report was in January of 2020. So if anybody is interested in learning a little bit more about that, the AMR Industry Alliance website, which is www.amrindustryaLliance.org, contains all this information. Actually, it contains the framework, it contains the PNECs, and it contains the Alliance report. So while we're pleased with the steps that we've taken, we recognize there's more to do. And I'd like to tell you a little bit more about what's next. And I'll talk about 2 key objectives. First and foremost, it's actually to drive implementation of the framework and the PNECs across our members and their supply chains. And we're also, seeking to grow our membership. So to give you some context, whilst the Alliance has approximately 100 member companies and trade associations, those that manufacture at a commercial scale antibiotics number around about 20. And all of those companies, and we have some very significant players among our membership, together, those companies represent approximately 1/3 of the global supply of antibiotics. So we're fairly large, but we don't represent all of industry. So it's important that, number one, we do what we say we're going to do, and that is implement our framework and manufacture antibiotics across our supply chain, meeting the PNECs, and that continues as a work in progress. And also seek to exert influence beyond our membership in whichever way we can do that. So I'm very pleased to tell you that one of the objectives that we're working on right now is to take our framework and PNECs and use those as the basis of a consensus standard. So we're currently working with the British Standards Institute on a project to do just that, to develop a publicly available specification. This is a work in progress. It will involve stakeholders, and in the development of what will become a standard or publicly available specification. So through this session, I'd just like to say that stakeholders who are interested in the process can reach out to the British Standards Institute directly, or can contact me, and I assume my contact details are available through the program information. But please feel free to reach out if you're interested at all in working in either helping shape the standard or review the standard that we would aim to develop. So our eventual aim, of course, is to move to a certification scheme, which I think would address many of the concerns that I've heard others refer to. So ultimately, antibiotic suppliers would be able to certify that their antibiotics are made to a given environmental standard. Now, I'd like to just pick up on a point that Joachim made about regulation. The Alliance, just to be very clear, is not opposed to regulation. And in fact, and I know this because I wrote the letter, but the Alliance wrote comments during the consultation period for the Indian regulations and expressed support for the concept of regulation in India. So I just want to be very clear in terms of where we stand. Now, of course, we had some comments about the detail of the regulation, and we offered some thoughts and suggestions to the Indian regulators. But we are supportive of sensibly constructed regulation because I think it will help ultimately control the issue. Our work is what I like to call directionally correct. So while many other people make calls for action and make demands on groups, including industry, to do something, what we have done is do something. And that's what we continue to do. So we're not waiting for regulations. We're not waiting for other instruments. We're trying to address the issue. And whatever we do, we believe, would be pretty much aligned with wherever, let's say, a regulation comes in. It should be aligned with what a regulation might contain. So I also wanted to finish by talking about another project that the Alliance is a technical partner in. So we don't lead this project. It's known as RAMP, or the Responsible Antibiotic Manufacturing Platform. It's managed by the Stockholm International Water Institute, or SIWI, and it's a public-private partnership. And it's looking across the supply life cycle from manufacturing, where through our involvement, we're hoping to help shape the manufacturing requirements of the project, all the way through to procurement, to further the responsible antibiotic supply. And the question really that the project is posing and seeking to address is, how best can procurement processes help incentivize change, recognizing and appropriately valuing responsibly manufactured antibiotics? So I think with that, hopefully I've given you an overview of kind of what we've done and what we are doing. And I'd like to pass it back to you, Peter. Of course, I'd be happy to answer any questions in the Q&A at the end. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Steve, and I'm sure there will be questions. And yeah, I think I totally agree. I think the AMR Industry Alliance is a very encouraging coalition. I think what is really remarkable is this is an alliance that is including companies from high-income countries, also from low and middle-income countries. You have research-based companies and you have generic producers. So that is something that we do not see very often. I think this is actually unique. And you are really, I mean, looking at the antimicrobial resistance. And what you did for the environment, although, as you said, maybe imperfect, but it is something which is concrete. And you mentioned the option that ultimately it may lead to a certification scheme. That, of course, would be something that then could be easily linked to procurement practices. Because one danger, and I do believe that changing the way that hospitals in Europe are buying antibiotics is going to change the market. And we have to do market shaping. That is the most efficient solution to this problem. But it won't work if every hospital is putting up their own requirements for procurement, because then you have to respond to so different tenders. So a certification scheme would certainly be something that would help. And I think, and Joachim mentioned another possible solution, transparency. If governments would know, I think in Germany there are like 15 antibiotics where there's only one registered supplier. There you know that you only even have one registered supplier. But there are other antibiotics, you may have 4 or 5 registered suppliers, and still they all buy the API, the active pharmaceutical ingredient, from the same company in China or India. So that is something where transparency would help governments to make a risk assessment in terms of health security. Where is our biggest risk of actually having supply chain interruptions? Well, and with that, I would like to hand over to Dame Sally Davis. I'm very happy that you're joining us. You don't need an introduction. You have done so much for antimicrobial resistance in the fight against antimicrobial resistance when you were the Chief Medical Officer. And now you're still with us as the UK Special Envoy. Sally, can you tell us a bit about what you think, what do you think would be the solutions for this problem? What should the politics do? And there, as Steve and Joachim pointed out, there are different players. We need regulations. This is the governments. We need those who procure who need to change. We need the industry to do something. And certainly we need other players as well. So over to you, Sally.
Thank you, Peter. And it's a great pleasure to be here and to listen to the other speakers. I always learn. And I want to tell you, you have a novel audience. A meter away at my face level on my windowsill is a squirrel who's watching me, watching you with great interest. And we all know we're at a critical juncture in the world as we watch firsthand this impact of a global pandemic on lives and livelihoods. We're continuing to collaborate globally to fight COVID-19 as our greatest challenge of the moment. But it's also, I think, for AMR, our greatest opportunity to use this as a defining point in time to prepare for our future. So we've got to act now with our eyes firmly on tomorrow. Just as at the start of this year, the World Health Organization published a list of what they considered to be their biggest threats for the 2020s decade. One was the pandemic, another was AMR, and we're witnessing and experiencing both right now, concurrently and increasingly. Indeed, I talk about the pandemic of COVID as the lobster put in the boiling water and making a big noise, and the AMR as the lobster put in cold water, heating up slowly, not making any noise, but my golly, it could have an even worse impact. So we in the UK are clear, we've got to do everything in our power to protect humanity from another pandemic and from a pandemic we know that's happening, even if we don't see and hear about it in the same way we do COVID-19. The impact of COVID-19 means I can't overstress the urgency of preparing and of acting now, whilst we still can, to counter the increasing levels of drug resistance. We haven't got time to wait. We're seeing right now that global threats do not respect borders, and nowhere will be safe until everywhere is safe. All of us on this call have been saying this about AMR for a while, but actually the world is beginning to hear this and to see it. And all these issues hold for AMR, antimicrobial resistance. And as we're seeing in the global response to COVID-19, global collaboration is the most effective way to tackle global health threats. And indeed, my three previous speakers and Peter Baer from the WHO all highlighted that what one country does matters to all the others. And look how we have over 170 economies joining COVAX, a groundbreaking collaboration mechanism to accelerate equitable access to COVID-19 vaccines for every country. We need, likewise, a global system through WHO, Food and Agriculture Organization, and Organization for Animal Health that accelerates action and advances a shared global vision for addressing AMR. Until last year, I was the co-convener of the UN Interagency Coordination Group on AMR, and we had representatives from all those organizations, many more, not just UN ones, as well as individual experts. Our global recommendations were clear. We need a systematic, One Health approach to AMR across global, regional, national, and individual levels. That needs leadership, it needs accountability, and it needs collaboration and new stakeholders as well. With a global leaders group to maintain the urgency and highlight the scale of the challenge of AMR, national governments can be greater than the sum of their parts. And I'm really proud that 135 countries have actually finished their own national action plans to address AMR. 50 more are in the process of developing them. This gives us a plan and a way forward. Though of course, there's always the issue of funding them and making it happen. But we hope we can work through the UN system as an international community and keep AMR on the agenda, acting with the full force of governments, clinicians for humans, animals, and fish, as well as academics and investigators. We know success comes from working together. Therefore, the UK will be using its G7 presidency next year to reflect on what we've learned from COVID and how we prevent such global health crises ever happening on this scale again. Germany put health on the G7 agenda. We will continue this. The ACT Accelerator for COVID vaccines is bringing together research, manufacturing, and finance mobilization at an unprecedented pace and with unparalleled levels of cooperation across countries and industry. Our efforts to develop manufacturing capacity around the world for vaccines must be matched by a long-term supply, as we've been hearing, of quality antimicrobials so we can continue to treat and prevent these infectious diseases that we currently can beat. We need to make the most of our current efforts. We've got to look ahead. We have to build for the long term. We all know, and Celine put it beautifully, how in times of medical crisis, individual or national, patients depend on there being secure, sustainable supply chains of medicines that they need. I absolutely heard her story about when you can't get them. I haven't forgotten 2 years ago, the burning down of a factory in China, which made Pip-Taz, and the impact that had, not just short term, but as you said, Celine, longer term on patient treatment. As has been demonstrated by COVID-19, many countries, and this includes the UK, lack the domestic manufacturing capacity to supply PPE and ventilators on patients in critical care, which is why our Prime Minister implored countries to reduce trade barriers. So to sustain and scale up the supply of antimicrobials, we're going to need to innovate and implement pull incentives to ensure antimicrobials reach those that need them most. We also need to find a way to keep the antimicrobials we currently have on the market and produced sustainably. So I really welcome this joint French WHO-led project that you talked about, Celine. In the UK, we're clear antibiotics have a value to society and to healthcare systems that far exceeds what traditional pricing and payment models can bring. That's why antibiotics need to be seen as more than a single prescription for a single person, but as a global public good and an essential element of our social infrastructure. Equitable, timely, and affordable antibiotics will protect the health of our societies by saving lives and giving our health systems the best chance of treating us. To achieve this, we in the UK have launched a world-first scheme to trial paying for antibiotics by subscription rather than by pill. This is our pilot of a pull incentive. We hope this will result in new antibiotics being developed, which can reach patients in 2022, but we do know we're a small part of the market. Our global health everywhere now depends on other countries pursuing similar innovative incentive mechanisms. The Swedes are joining in, the Germans are looking at pricing mechanisms to test similar models in their own domestic markets. AMR is integral not only to our health systems, but our environmental sustainability and trade supplies. As Dr. Larson has been telling us, through a One Health approach to AMR, we can tackle the issue domestically and internationally to build supply chain resilience. Global health security begins at home. In the UK, our farmers reduced antibiotic usage for livestock by 40% between 2014 and 2017, yet maintaining productivity whilst promoting the highest standards of animal husbandry. We can't let our protein consumption be the death knell for the planet or for modern medicine, but we can farm better. We can fish better. We can eat better. We need to think and act sustainably. If you look at what the Norwegians have done with the salmon fishing, it's impressive. Using vaccines. Already we're seeing purchasing habits trend towards sustainable farmed livestock, but these can carry short-term increased production costs for businesses. We've got to think long-term. Reducing antibiotic use will lead to resilient supply chains and secure long-term financial returns. And that's why the UK government's Department of Health is collaborating with FAIR, the UN Principles for Responsible Investment and the Access to Medicines Foundation. At the World Economic Forum earlier this year, we launched the Investor Action on AMR initiative. We're calling on investors to commit to making sustainable investments and align with global best practices on AMR, as described by Stephen, thereby encouraging the companies in which they invest to do the right thing. As Joachim has said, we need to think about where our antibiotic waste is going and make our manufacturing and waste disposal more sustainable for the future through transparent risk management strategies and producing high quality products. But we must also remember that more than 70%, indeed for some antibiotics, more than 90%, is either peed or pooed out by animals, whether they're humans, animals in the food chain, pets, or fish. And they too contaminate our surface water and our deep water. Globally, the scientific evidence is mounting that antibiotics are polluting our rivers, and Joachim has been leading this work. Last year, the world's largest study of antibiotics in water found that over 2/3 of 700 samples from around the globe contained antibiotics, from the Thames in the UK to the Danube in Germany, the Tigris to the Iowa River. This is destroying the health of our rivers and potentially of humans. We in the UK support the Access to Medicines Foundation benchmark that evaluates how companies are responding to AMR in the areas where they can make the biggest impact, including on managing manufacturing waste. So I'm delighted to hear Steve update us about the recent positive steps that show industry taking environmental AMR risk management seriously. Most companies evaluated by the Access to Medicine Foundation's benchmark do have environmental strategies to minimize their impacts, and that 11 of the 13 with strategies are members of the AMR Industry Alliance is great. And it's wonderful to see the AMR Industry Alliance Common Antibiotic Manufacturing Framework. And I was going to say, we can't rest on our laurels, but Steve has told us you're not. You're developing the consensus standards with the British Standards Institute. We need that as the next stage of action, and for companies to provide clear pictures of implementation across their own and suppliers' sites, and to allow researchers to understand the impact of antibiotic manufacturing. Steve also highlighted RAMP, and I'm thrilled that the Stockholm International Water Institute and the UN Development Programme are running a collaboration to encourage procurers, regulators, and pharma companies to collectively shift to responsible practices. This can really be a game changer for antibiotics and environmental sustainability. Through the UK's Global AMR Innovation Fund, we're co-funding with IDRC in Canada some innovative projects to reduce the use of antibiotics in farming, including one I love, a nanobubble technology known as fish jacuzzis for fish farms in Southeast Asia. As we all know, fish is the human eating protein that's going up fastest, and much of it is farmed in Southeast Asia. Our food and environmental security depends on building sustainable and diverse end-to-end supply chains, which is why the environment is integral to our One Health approach, and why I'm delighted the World Health Summit is addressing this today. In January 2020, we heard about the Indian government consulting on draft legislation. We do hope, as a leading antibiotic producer, that they can bring this draft law, even improved following consultation, into practice, because this could limit the creation of new antimicrobial resistant bacteria, and we need other countries following suit. We need many more of these innovative and collaborative approaches at local, national, and global level. My vision, and I hope everyone's vision, is to make this year, 2020, a year that counts, a year when we sat up and not only realized that what we needed to do, we had to get on with, but the year that we actually got on with delivering it. 2030, the deadline for the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, is now only 10 years away, and every moment and decision until then matters. There is no time to delay because of COVID-19. Indeed, it's because of COVID-19 that we need to turbocharge our action on AMR. If we show the will in 2020, then 2021 will show the next part of the way. Through the UK's G7 presidency, and with every one of our global partners' contributions, this world can strengthen its global health security for good. I look to the global system to accelerate action and advance this shared global vision. We need leadership and to work through the multilateral system, to share as we have done this morning, to extend that, to learn from that sharing, and to take action. And of course, lots of face masks and plenty of hand washing at this time. But that said, I do believe we can do it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sally, for this impressive overview on what happened so far, and also your outlook and what we should do in 2020 and in the next 10 years until the SDG aim to reach them by 2030. We are very good in the time. I would like to put up a couple of questions that we received. Let me try, if I put answer live, can you then see the question? Or do I have to read it? I probably have to read it.
I think you'll have to read it, Peter. Yeah.
Okay, so let me read. So the first question was from Sabiha Esak, and she was asking, what about low and middle income countries? We are talking here mainly about Europe, European countries, and what about access to affordable antibiotics in low and middle income countries? And maybe I can start off on this question, given that this is a typical WHO issue. I mean, the reason why we are focusing in this panel, we try to focus on Europe, is because in Europe, you can really see that the supply chain interruptions are mostly due, I mean, there's an issue on the supply side, not on the procurement side. While in many low and middle income countries, there may be more serious problems, but then there's a much more broader multitude of reasons for why a certain hospital may not actually get a certain drug. And that can also have a lot of reasons on actually the demand side. So that is an issue that we are addressing with GARD-P, the foundation in Geneva that we created, and with whom we are currently working on an access project that would cover not only access to old antibiotics, but also access to new antibiotics. What we have seen in the past years is that many of the new antibiotics that come to market are only registered in very few countries, not even in all high-income countries. And so we want to actually expand access to those products also to other countries, including low and middle-income countries. So this is not an area that is forgotten. It is high on our agenda in WHO. Is there anybody else wants to say something about access in low and middle income countries?
I think we all agree it's essential. The issue will be price, but there are various ways that one can sort that out. And then the stewardship. We will need to be reassured that as new ones come, that they are stewarded properly. But of course, people can do that all over the world. So that should not be an excuse to not make them available. Interestingly, in the last year, 4 new antibiotics have not been registered in the EU. So there is an issue also for the high-income countries that will need to be addressed.
Yes, thanks for highlighting that, Sally. And that is a trend which is very worrying that we can indeed see. We have a question from Daniela de Biais. She asks whether production of essential antibiotics could be supported financially by each state, at least for internal needs, so that though they don't have to rely on big pharma. It should not be at the expense. It should not be that expensive, and maybe there could be a mutual agreement between European countries to help each other. Any volunteers?
Maybe I can say something about it.
Yes.
I was approached some years ago about initiatives from Swedish actors who were interested in actually starting generics production in Sweden, but they realized very quick, because of environmental concerns rather than supply chain issues as the first point actually, although we would address both things. They realized that we in Sweden, and I think many other European countries, have generic substitution and reimbursement system that effectively needs to be changed before there is any revenue for national production, really, because at least how it works in Sweden, we have a generic substitution system that makes you exchange to the type of product that is basically the cheapest product, and that's the only one that is reimbursed by tax money or by insurance money in other countries. So unless you can beat other companies in terms of price, you cannot sell. So that means that in order to open up such a possibility, as the questionnaire here asks for, you need to change that system. You need to change the system so that it's not only lowest price that counts. You need to have some other measures, whether that is diversity of availability to address the supply chain issue, or whether that is pollution control or something else that address pollution issues. Well, you need to change the laws there to make it possible.
Celine, please.
I think the COVID-19 has changed many things, and it has changed some questions were very impossible to address. I think last year, this kind of question was out of the table, I would say, but now everything is discussed. So I think it is something that is discussed at EU level and at French level as well, as one of the things we have to think about. I don't know if it's the right solution, because as always, the devil is in the details. And there are so many actually root causes that lead to shortages that you need to proceed stepwise and to analyze very thoroughly the situation beforehand. But yeah, I think that's one of the topics everybody is thinking about. Could it be public exclusively, public-private, or private with some kind of joint procurement or whatever? I think it is open for discussion, and I completely agree with Joachim. The whole system needs to be thoroughly evaluated. And if I may say a word about shortages and lack of availability, I think here we are dealing with shortages. That's the topic of the discussion. But let's not forget that sometimes you don't have access to an essential antibiotic because it is not on the market, or it was on the market and it was discontinued. And we think that's also a very important aspect. And the project we have with WHO deals with both sides. So the shortages issue, so it's on the market, but you don't have it for many months. And also the lack of marketing or discontinuation of marketing. And the causes are usually not exactly the same. And one final word, because before I stop, I think until now, and the COVID-19 has really changed things, we were dealing with mitigation strategies regarding shortages. So not really the root causes were addressed. And right now we can discuss about addressing root causes, which means changing the system, which is much more complicated, but which will lead to sustainable change, even so it will take probably much more time. And final, innovation is of course essential, and Sally highlighted that. But remember, the new antibiotics will become old quite quickly, so we need a sustainable way to have access to them when they will be off patent. So that's one more reason to deal with shortages and marketing.
Yeah, Peter, Steve, if I could maybe just pick up on a couple of the other questions that I see there as well, just in one quick sort of sentence. So people have asked questions about access to accurate diagnostics. They've asked about, and it's very germane to the last point, new research for antibiotics. How do we get new antibiotics and incentivize it? And although these are not areas that I'm an expert in, the AMR Industry Alliance is also very actively involved in the diagnostics issue and in R&D. And you know, incentivizing R&D so that the market works is a pretty critical issue if we want a sustainable supply of new antibiotics. Obviously, we don't have time to discuss that in this session, but it is really important. And I think the other thing that I would just add is in terms of you know, addressing sustainability, I think we do have to recognize that most of what is made is consumed one way or another, and most of the antibiotics that are in the environment do come through the actual use of the antibiotics, whether it's in agriculture, farm animals, or human use and consumption. So you know, whilst we've been focused on manufacturing, and it's very right to focus on that because there's a risk of very high concentrations if manufacturing is not adequately controlled, it's not the full picture by any stretch of the imagination.
Sally, please, yes.
So we're talking about quality of drugs and their production, and I know that we from our Fleming Fund give money to a part of the WHO that works with low-income countries on counterfeit and falsified drugs. And antibiotics are one of the big areas of counterfeit and falsified. So we need to think about that as well as the environmental controls. We're thinking about resilience, aren't we, of the supply, and clearly, you know, lots of little factories all around the place are not the answer, because for all if one burnt down, the others would still be there. It doesn't give you enough return on your investment. You need a largish factory. And I then think that as we talk through about public or public-private, we have to remember that the public sector is not used to running this sort of thing. And I personally hope that Lord O'Neill's idea of nationalising the pharmaceutical companies' antibiotic systems won't happen, because I think we would get it wrong. But how can we work in partnership so those who are really good at it do it for the best price, the best quality, and deliver the outcomes that we need. And I think we just need to think through who's good and remember what we're trying to do. But the French WHO project will teach us a lot and help us plan for that. But I hope you'll share the results, Celine, as soon as you possibly can, because we've got a bit of momentum now. And my experience is that that drops off within a year. So we're going to need to get some action this year and next year.
I let maybe Peter explain about the dissemination plan that was included in the project.
Yeah, so, I mean, maybe on the project, we are hiring actually somebody who is going to work full-time on the project, and he is also going to be responsible for the reach out. And we really want, I mean, this is really a project that is financed by mainly the European Commission to help France. But we really want to do the reach out. So we don't want this to be French solutions for French problems. We want that are only discussed in France. No, we want to actually include stakeholders, including industry from other countries, mainly European countries. And we also want to have a discussion and also bring us into the discussion with other players. And that includes the OECD, who are currently doing a mapping actually of the European manufacturing facilities. So I think we really want to make this a broader endeavor. And I'm really excited about it because, as you said, Sally, I think this is now where we can shape things, and which is an opportunity, but it's also worrying. And as you said, I don't believe in subsidies. I think subsidies would make it worse. Subsidies to manufacturers in Europe would actually make the downward spiraling of the pricing basis worse, because you give subsidies to a company, so the price is not what it should be. So they will compete with the Chinese, the Indian manufacturers. They can outcompete you easily because they have actually more flexibility in their margin. So the price level will be even further reduced, and it will make it worse. And the reality is that currently the hospitals are paying a price for parenteral antibiotics that is not reflecting the cost of sustainable environmental production. And that is not just. The hospitals are actually free riding on environmental pollution in India. And that is why they actually can buy antibiotics for pennies or for cents of the euro. And that is what we have to change. And that is, I do think that even if all the European health systems are in crisis because of the rising costs, I don't think that paying actually something more for the old generic antibiotics are having actually a significant influence of the overall cost of a health system in Switzerland or Germany. And I think that is what we have to change. There's no way that we should subsidize actually prices that are not reflecting an appropriate supply chain and production scheme in industry. Joachim, I see you and nodding. You want to say something?
Multiple things. I can maybe say something about the last thing you just said about subsidization. I think it's really important to think about, if any kind of subsidization or whatever you call it, to think about what you're really rewarding. Of course, there's no problem per se that drugs are produced in India. It's a good thing that they get jobs, of course. So it would be problematic to reward European production just because it's European production. What one should reward, in this case, it would be pollution control and diversity of suppliers. And yes, whether that happens in India or Europe is actually not the question. So it should be something that any company should actually be able to benefit. So think about what's rewarded. So that was the comment to that. Steve, I want to follow up what you said about, which correct, of course, the largest amount of antibiotics are, of course, consumed and are spread via urine and feces, basically. And we shouldn't forget about those, as some of the questions here also are raised about. That's true, but we at the same time need to think about they are diluted. So even if you have 1% of the antibiotics coming out from manufacturing, they might come out from one pipeline, all of it, whereas the rest is diluted into 10 million different sources around the world. So the concentrations might be so low they don't do anything, even if you add them up, sort of, but maybe they do. So I don't think that we should dismiss this, should we call it, more dilute spread of antibiotics and other sources. I think that needs to be taken into account as well. We got the question here from Sabia Esak that mentions emissions from hospital and intensive animal food production. That may be substantial, and I agree. I think industrial releases, they sort of are the tip of the iceberg in terms of concentrations. And then you have a concentration range falling where you pass hospital emissions, for example, and animal production, and down to just emissions from normal poo and pee, perhaps. And all of these may cause problems, but maybe attacking the worst problems first, where you can get most things for the buck, sort of, could be a worthwhile thing to do. It's much easier to deal with an industrial emission problem than to deal with all human excreta across the world, for example. And that brings us back to what you also mentioned, Steve, here about directionality that is correct. I think industry has a correct directionality in terms of trying to get basically a system in place that people agree about on how should we regulate antibiotic releases and get discharge limit, how should they be measured, etc. But it takes time. Industry have worked now for a long time. They've been aware of the issue for 15 years, and there are other measures that could be done much quicker. I think we should aim for what industry is also aiming for, a regulation, a worldwide regulation, if in the best of worlds, for that. But that will take time. We all know that. And such things like rewarding transparency, which actually has nothing to do with how big the releases are, but just show us where you produce stuff and we reward you. That's a very, very simple step that could be taken tomorrow, basically, in a procurement system from a hospital.
Or it could be in the regulation system that when drug companies apply for registration of their drug,
that was it.
They have to say where every element of it was manufactured.
Yeah.
You know, you could make it part of the EMA and as part of European regulation.
And of course, the EMA, they do have all this information, but it's considered a business secret. So they're not permitted to make it public. And that is something where we maybe, I don't say that all the, maybe not the whole supply chain, but I think the API manufacturer and where it's situated, that is something that for many reasons, environmental reasons, but also health security reasons would be sensible. And it's something that we are seeing in other industries as well. And the information is available in the regulatory authorities. I think there is a question for you, Steve, in the chat, and I saw you are reading the questions. It's from Priyanka Singh. She asks with which companies and stakeholders you have been working in India, and what were the challenges in coordinating and collaborating with such companies?
So we have Indian companies that are members of the Alliance. For example, one of the founding members is Centrient Pharmaceuticals, but we have other companies. Aurobindo joined the Alliance more recently, which we were pleased to see. So, and there are others, so they're part of the Alliance. We've also worked, I personally have been involved in work on RAMP with some of the trade associations in India, as well as we've tried to socialize RAMP with state governments and industry trade associations in India. So I would say there's definitely a willingness to engage. There is a degree of skepticism as well, and a slight feeling that I would characterize as, hey, you know, the focus seems to be on us all the time, and maybe that's somewhat unfair. You know, in India, although they're just proposing bringing in regulation to control antibiotic emissions, they have, of course, got regulation that relates to the use of zero liquid discharge, which does make a big difference, and that is in place for API manufacturing now. And it was brought in place because of very significant concerns about pollution, in essence, chemical pollution. Nothing to do with antimicrobial resistance per se. So I think you know, there's a degree of they recognize that they're in the spotlight, and like anybody else, when you're in the spotlight, part of it feels a bit unfair, but there's probably some home truths in there as well. So you know, I think we welcome more engagement and collaboration with Indian companies and Indian organizations, and we do that. You know, we're doing that in different ways. So I hope that answers the question. But there's certainly, I wouldn't say there's any lack of willingness to engage.
Yeah, Sally, please. Yes, you want to say something.
I wondered if this was a moment to congratulate industry on putting together the AMR Action Fund, which Peter will know as much or maybe more than I do, and Steve will know about, but $1 billion fund, the Wellcome Trust and the European Bank have contributed, but to help bring through up to 4 new antibiotics. So I think the industry is responding and we should congratulate them. But of course, we want more. But I want more from governments and practitioners. I mean, and I'm sure Celine and Joachim do too. So it's not one-sided. We need to really work with everyone on this and One Health.
Yeah, and Sally, thanks for mentioning the fund. I mean, not that I've been personally involved in the fund, but like you, I think it's a fantastic step. And if I have this correct, I believe it's really meant to be a kind of an interim measure to buy time to allow more sustainable solutions and market-based solutions to be put in place. So it's filling a short-term need. It's very significant money and funding and expertise that will be made available to help bring through new antibiotics, but it's also to buy time for the players, all the players, including government, to find more sustainable solutions.
Yeah, I think the average income you can generate with a new antibiotic at the moment is around $50 million per year, which is not allowing to actually recoup the costs. Having said that, many of the new antibiotics, also those that have not been registered in Europe, were not new classes. They were not groundbreaking new inventions. So we would call them, basically in other areas, we would call them Me Too drugs. And Me Too drugs usually are not actually getting a premium on the market. But for antibiotics, it's really, I mean, it's really bad. And thanks, Sally, for mentioning the AMR Action Fund, which definitely is a really major step forward to finance the phase 2, phase 3 trials. And we are very happy to collaborate with the industry alliance on this. And it's going to buy us time until we fix the problem. And I think if I look at the questions, there's Daniela who is raising the issue. She says, if that we should actually work with everybody, and if we come up with strict legislation on avoiding pollution without discussing solutions with the companies, could it be that they just decide to exit the antibiotic market because costs are rising? Am I wrong? And I think, no, you are not wrong. And that is, I think that is also the risk that, I mean, if you try to change it too drastically, even today, we have many companies who would actually love to drop out certain markets, but they are the only remaining supplier, so they can't. And if we take the example of benzoyl penicillin that Celine Puccini put up at the very beginning, we are down to 3 manufacturers of active pharmaceutical ingredient worldwide. So if you have 3 manufacturers and you tell them now, and this is a very low margin, high volume business. And if you tell them, well, now you have to raise the standards and we are going to switch from one to the other, maybe they will just stop altogether and try to make biosimilars where they have a much more interesting margin. I think also, so it's a real issue. We also have to acknowledge that for a company that is marketing products and has market authorizations, for them to change the supplier for an active pharmaceutical ingredient is going to take them 1 to 2 years, because they have to actually change every national market authorization. So they have to go to the EMA, to Swissmedic, to FDA, notify the new supplier. They are going to inspect the new supplier. So this is it's a real investment if you want to change something in your supply chain, because for every change in your supply chain, you have to actually get the approval of all the national authorities in the countries where you're selling the drug. So that also, if before you do that, you really have to be sure that you actually have a sustainable market over the next years, because otherwise it's an investment that you're not going to do. And so I do think it is a real problem. I also wanted to make a comment on, India in the spotlight. It is of course also unfair because Europe just exported the pollution. Because why? The API manufacturing is chemical production, which is heavily polluting, per se, at least at risk. So nobody in Europe actually, I don't think that the European population would be very happy if we would put up these chemical plants all over Europe again. So people are usually pretty happy that if these polluting industries are not in your own backyard. And so it is also, I think that is also one aspect to take into account. We have a question from Enrico Baraldi, and he says that, yes, you mentioned a couple of solutions, transparency, incentives to fix the market, but which barrier do the panelists see to implementing these solutions now? Sally, please.
Well, I think the biggest problem is we pay so little for antibiotics. Professor Puccini highlighted that, and I picked it up too. Antibiotics generate very little income. You yourself said that to make, you can sell 50 million of a new antibiotic, say it's dollars, in a year. But then to keep the lights on in the factory and produce it takes 300 million. So we are paying too little, particularly for our old ones and still probably for the new ones. And it doesn't really reflect the advantage that effective treatment of infectious diseases gives our society. We pay little because we're used to it. And why would we pay more if we don't have to? We pay little because our health technology assessments actually value them as they value other drugs, on the disability life years or the quality life years and life saved. It isn't the way we should be doing it. And our pilot project with 2 drugs is actually trying to look at a totally different way of valuing them. So it's not just to the patient, that's part of the value, but the value to the NHS of not having an infection in our National Health Service that could be passed to someone else. The value to our health service and our community of not having AMR. And I think they're very difficult questions, but we are working with a number of economists and with industry input to try and see what we can learn and how we can value them better. It is likely to take the price up, but what we're also doing is we're doing a subscription model. So we agree with the company how much they're going to be paid for the year, and then the doctors can prescribe whatever number they need. Very few, the company still got their money. A lot, the company still got their money. So we can steward the new antibiotics effectively. And I think we need to do things like that. I'm not saying ours is the best answer, but at least we're trying it. And I think we're going to have to pay more. And actually, let me finish by saying on paying more, look at COVID. It is costing trillions and trillions of dollars. If we had put in place effective preparation, it would have cost a lot of money, but it would have been far cheaper. To put in place now effective antibiotics, to pay properly for them so we've got them but well stewarded, will save money in the long term. And we have to keep reminding people of that. Thanks.
Thank you, Sally. I think that was a very good final statement from you. I think we have 6 minutes to go, so I would like to ask the other panelists, what do you want to say?
Could I start, Peter?
Yes.
Sure, I'll link to what Sally said. I also think we pay too little for antibiotics and for many other things, basically because we don't pay the externalities. And that links to what Peter said. We outsource production, for example, to India. So we don't see the pollution and we don't pay for the pollution. We need to start thinking about paying for all the costs involved, whether that is a diverse production chain, whether that is pollution control. We need to pay for it. It's not about bringing companies out of business. It's about paying for what we all want, a fair production that works in a way that is sustainable at the end of the day. So I'm not so worried about excluding companies in that sense, particularly not if we have systems that rewards good behavior rather than excludes people from the market. And Sally brings up the example now of which many talk about, the malfunctioning economic systems of drug development. And we've discussed that for decades now, I think. And I think with regards to both supply chain and environmental issues, we also have a malfunctioning economic system for antibiotics and for all drugs, I would say, actually, because we only value low cost. That's really what it's all going for. We need to change the system so that not only low cost is valued. Without doing that, we're not going to the root of the problem, as Celine talked about. We need to go there and take this opportunity in the COVID crisis to think about the roots. Thanks.
Please, Celine.
I think we all give the same reply. That is complex. We need to change the systems, the paradigm. I hope it will be possible. I sincerely hope there is a window of opportunity thanks to COVID. I hope we won't revert back to old habits next year. So we need to be very, very pushy right now if we want to change things. I think there is a window to kind of sell prevention as less costly than cure. But yeah, I would be careful because old ways are always so easy to get back to.
Yeah, and it's always very difficult to get praised for prevention because we see it with COVID. Then people come up and say, yeah, but nobody died. Why do you make such a fuss? Steve, your final words.
Yeah. Well, I think the other panelists have given excellent responses, which I would concur with, by the way. And I think, from my perspective and the AMR Industry Alliance, whilst all these fine debates continue, we recognize that there are things that we can do now, and that's what we're trying to push. It's not a switch, though. It takes time to do the sort of work that I've described, to assess all these different manufacturing sites, to identify what needs to improve, to help build capacity. If you simply walk away from a supplier because they may not be doing exactly the right thing, then you'll end up with the kind of shortages that we all wish to avoid. So, there's quite a bit of capacity building, hand-holding and support needed to ensure that we continue to make and supply these critical life-saving medicines. And of course, I think it's still true to say that more people die from lack of access to antibiotics than from antimicrobial resistance. So, what we're making might be regarded as a commodity, but it's a life-saving, essential commodity. So our job is to keep the lights on in those factories, and to keep the product in the supply chain, and to do it in a way that minimizes the environmental impact. I think long term, these systems that we're talking about will change, and I'm encouraged by that, but I'm also encouraged by the fact that what we're doing now will help support that and help us be better prepared.
Yeah, thank you all. Thank you, Steve. I think this is now the end of the session. I would like to thank the panelists. Thank you all for joining. In particular, Steve, you got up very early in the United States. Thank you for joining. I think that was a really interesting session. I apologize, we didn't answer all the questions, but I think we covered a good half of it. So thank you all, and enjoy the rest of the World Health Summit. I do sincerely hope that next year we can go there again in person, because that is it is more fun, I have to say. So having said that, thank you all. Thank you for joining, and goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.